It is June 18th, 1815. The rain has finally stopped. The fields outside the Belgian village of Waterloo are soaked, muddy, and about to become the most consequential piece of ground in modern history. Two armies face each other. On one side, the Duke of Wellington and his allied forces. On the other, Napoleon Bonaparte, Bonaparte. Exiled emperor, returned conqueror, the most dangerous military mind the world had ever seen. By the end of the day, one of them will change everything. And it won't be Napoleon, but what if it was? What if the rain fell one day earlier? What if Marshal Grouchy had arrived with his 30,000 men before the Prussians? What if one order had been given differently? One hill had been taken an hour sooner. One moment had gone the other way. History is full of these hinges. Moments so small, so fragile, that the entire direction of human civilization balanced on them like a coin spinning on its edge. Waterloo was one of those moments, and the world that exists today, your world, was born from the side it landed on. To understand what a Napoleon victory would have meant, you first need to understand what Napoleon actually was. Not the cartoon villain of British propaganda, not the short-tempered tyrant of Hollywood. The real Napoleon. He was the product of the French Revolution, the living embodiment of its promise that a man of talent could rise from nothing to the top of the world regardless of the blood he was born with. He was a Corsican outsider who became Emperor of France, and everywhere his armies went, they carried something revolutionary with them. Not just guns, ideas. Historian Andrew Roberts, who wrote the definitive modern biography of Napoleon, argues that the Napoleonic Code, the legal framework Napoleon imposed across conquered Europe, was one of the most transformative documents in human history. It abolished feudalism, it established equality before the law, it ended the hereditary privileges of the aristocracy, it guaranteed religious freedom, it protected property rights. In countries where these ideas arrived with French soldiers, the old world crumbled. The new one began. At Waterloo, all of that was stopped. The Holy Alliance of conservative monarchies, Russia, Austria, Prussia, Britain, put Napoleon on a ship to a remote island in the South Atlantic and spent the next 3 decades trying to erase everything he had built. The Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe to restore the old royal families to power. Progressive movements were suppressed. Constitutions were torn up. The clock was turned back. Now imagine the clock wasn't turned back. If Napoleon wins at Waterloo, the first and most immediate consequence is the collapse of the Seventh Coalition. Wellington retreats. The Prussians under Blücher, already bloodied at Ligny 3 days earlier, cannot regroup fast enough. Within weeks, Paris is secure. Napoleon is back on his throne. And the monarchies of Europe face a choice they had hoped never to confront again. Fight on or negotiate. Most historians who have studied this scenario, including the military historian John Keegan, believe the coalition would have fractured. Russia was exhausted from its campaign since 1812. Austria's foreign minister Metternich had already privately suggested that a negotiated peace might be preferable to another decade of war. Britain, whose public was weary of conflict and whose economy was strained by years of blockade, had significant political voices calling for accommodation. A Napoleon who had just crushed the best army Britain could field would have been a Napoleon in an extraordinarily strong negotiating position. What does a negotiated Europe look like? Probably something like this. France retains its natural borders, the Rhine, the Alps, the Pyrenees. The satellite kingdoms Napoleon created across Europe survive in modified form. His brother Joseph remains somewhere in Spain, though perhaps with reduced territory. The Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states allied to France, continues to exist. And crucially, the conservative restoration that happened in our timeline does not happen. The Napoleonic Code stays. The feudal structures it demolished do not return. Here is where it gets genuinely strange and genuinely important. One of the greatest historical debates about this scenario centers on Germany. In our timeline, the defeat of Napoleon and the subsequent nationalist reaction against French domination helped create the conditions for German unification under Prussia in 1871. That unified Germany, built on Prussian military culture and Bismarckian realpolitik, went on to fight 2 world wars that killed over 70 million people. If Napoleon wins at Waterloo, the Prussian state never achieves the dominance it achieved in our timeline. The German-speaking world remains fragmented. a collection of smaller states under various forms of French influence. The specific combination of Prussian militarism and wounded nationalist pride that drove Germany toward catastrophe in 1914 and again in 1933 simply does not exist in the same form. Does this mean no World War I? No Hitler? No Holocaust? Not necessarily. History is not that simple. But the specific path that led to those catastrophes, the path that ran directly through the humiliation of France in 1871 and the unification of Germany under Prussian dominance, that path is gone. Economist and historian Darren Acemoglu, who studies how institutions shape the long-run development of nations, has found robust evidence that the regions of Europe where the Napoleonic Code was implemented and stayed implemented showed significantly stronger economic growth and institutional development through the 19th century than regions where it was reversed after 1815. The data suggests that the ideas Napoleon carried, equality before the law, protection of property, abolition of feudal privilege, were genuinely transformative for economic development wherever they took root. In a world where Napoleon wins at Waterloo, those ideas take root across a much wider swath of Europe. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain, might have spread faster across a continent where legal barriers to commerce and innovation had been dismantled. The emancipation of serfs, which didn't happen in Russia until 1861 in our timeline, might have come sooner in a Europe under French cultural dominance. The democratic movements of 1848, which were crushed in our timeline partly because the conservative powers had 3 decades to consolidate after Waterloo, might have succeeded. And what about Napoleon himself? He was 45 years old at Waterloo, in reasonable health despite the physical toll of 20 years of almost continuous warfare. A victorious Napoleon post-Waterloo would have had perhaps another 15 to 20 years of active leadership ahead of him. What would he have done with them? His own writings from St. Helena, the island where he actually spent his final years, reveal a man who claimed he would have turned toward consolidation rather than further conquest. He wrote extensively about what he called the grand design for Europe, a federation of sovereign states united by common law, common currency, and free trade. Something that sounds, when you read it carefully, remarkably like the European Union. Napoleon claimed this was always the destination, that the wars were not the goal, but the means. Whether you believe him depends on how much you trust the retrospective self-justifications of a man writing from exile. But the vision was there, clearly articulated, and in a post-Waterloo world, he would have had the power to try to build it. There is one more consequence that almost never gets discussed, and it is perhaps the most profound. In our timeline, the failure of Napoleon led directly to the strengthening of the British Empire. Britain, as the primary financial and military force behind the coalitions that defeated Napoleon, emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the undisputed global superpower. The 19th century was the British century. British colonialism expanded dramatically across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The economic and political structures that Britain imposed on its colonies, some beneficial, many exploitative, nearly all designed to serve British interests, shaped the developing world in ways that are still felt today. In a world where Napoleon survives and the British Empire does not achieve the same unchallenged dominance, the colonization of Africa and Asia unfolds differently. Not necessarily better. France had its own colonial ambitions and its own brutalities, but differently. The specific borders drawn across Africa in the 1880s, borders that cut across tribal lines, divided ethnic groups, created artificial nations that have spent the century and a half since independence trying to hold themselves together. Those borders might not exist. The specific forms of exploitation that Britain pioneered in India might not have developed in the same way. You are living in a world shaped by the rain that fell on June 17, 1815, by the mud that slowed Napoleon's artillery on the morning of June 18th, by a handful of hours that allowed the Prussians to arrive before the battle was decided. The world you know, its borders, its institutions, its wars, its wounds, flows from that single day. History doesn't have a correct answer. It has a path taken and an infinite number of paths not taken. Waterloo was taken. And every morning you wake up in the world it created, you are living inside a what-if that someone else's history made real. The coin landed. The question is whether you've ever stopped to wonder what was on the other side.